Hello and welcome. It's about 10 o'clock. It's the 9th day of May 2022. It is 61 degrees and sunny. I am very sleepy for some reason. I've been feeling kind of crappy for the last 2 weeks, haven't I? I don't know if it's the weather or whatever. Anyways, it's time for another episode of Why Is This a Thing? Why is this a thing? When we find interesting bits of internet stuff that at first glance seem to be newsworthy, but then when you actually look at them, you're like, this is not a thing. Literally, why? So, we've got a couple. First and foremost, Gini Di has somehow managed to get herself under the D&D attention wagon. I guess she posted something a couple days ago about DM prep, and the exact quote was that she said, "Don't overprepare is the worst advice new DMs can hear," and she claims that this actually hurt her development as a young DM, because when she asked somebody, "What should I do?" and somebody said, "Don't overprepare," and she was like, "Oh, I can't DM now because I was told not to overprepare and that I want to prepare," and I just... It's not a thing. First off, this is not a thing. Second, don't over-prepare. I mean, the first advice you should give anybody, whether it's a starting DM who's just starting out or a DM who's been doing it for 120 years, like, be prepared, dude. 1, session 0. How many times have I said this? Session 0. Whether session 0 is a whole session or the first 20 minutes of a game, establish the rules of your universe. And make sure everybody gets them. 1, be prepared. Know the rules. Have the basic stuff with you so you can run the game. Paper, pencil, dice, a couple spare character record sheets, at least one copy of the rules so you can look shit up. I mean, everything else is frosting on the cake, but you should at least have read the rules once or twice, have a general idea of how to run the game. Be prepared for if your players decide to do something that you weren't expecting, so you don't just sit there going, "Baby, I wasn't expecting you. I guess my campaign's over." No, trust yourself and be prepared enough that when they do something outrageous, you can run with it. The grandmother house. We talk about the grandmother house scenario all the time, and just, knowing what you have planned and then adapting. So if they do decide to go to grandma's house, you could still say, okay, well, there's still a couple things I can have happen on the way to grandma's house and at grandma's house. And you know what? I can reskin this encounter and put it over here. And so things can still kind of happen. And, I can still kind of fit the story around what they're doing, or maybe build a new story out of the direction they're going. Let's see where they're running with this grandma house thing, because I've got stacks of stuff and I've got things. So don't over-prepare is the worst advice. I would say that it's the worst advice. Be prepared. Okay? And trust yourself. Trust yourself enough to be able to run with it if they decide to go to grandma's house. Okay. So the second thing seems to be this confusion over 5e and D&D. This started a couple days ago when the Everyday Heroes D20 Modern 2022 announced that they picked up a couple rights to some movies like The Crow and Highlander, which I think has been tried before, and Total Recall, Escape from New York, a couple other ones. They've got a couple movie rights that they're attaching to the Everyday Heroes. And a couple articles came out saying, well, now you can have, Rambo in your D&D game and stuff like that. And this led to some misunderstanding. I don't know if this is intentionally misleading just to get people to click the article and go, wait, I can run Rambo in D&D? Or if this really was the guy didn't know the difference between 5e and D&D 5e. Because there is a difference between 5e D&D, and just D20. anybody can make a D20 system. Okay, Wizards of the Coast does not own the 20-sided dice. It is a symbol that appears naturally in nature, so they can't copyright that dice. They can't copyright the word D20. You can make a game using a D20. There are plenty of other games out there that aren't D&D that use some variation of rolling a D20 or 2D20 or 3D20 or D20 higher the better. D20 the lower the better. Whatever. Okay, so you can make a game that uses a D20. Now, you can make a game that says it's 5e compatible. The 5e SRD, which actually is different than the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, the first half of that goes into the stuff you can use to get that 5e label. Now, it doesn't mean it's for use with Dungeons & Dragons. Often these 5e games take the core mechanics that we're familiar with, strength, dex, con, armor class, but then they add some stuff to it. A perfect example, even though it was 3.5, but still it's a good example, is Mutant and Masterminds. Mutants and Masterminds, the bare bones is D&D 3.5 and now, but then they added a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't really cross over to the way what we think as D&D, races, levels, classes, magic, whatever. The core is still there, and there's a lot of other ones, like the space ones, like Eclipse Phase and other ones, and all these other 5e things that have the 5e label. But if you flip through them, you're going to maybe see a lot of things that don't sing D&D. Now, you could cross-pollinate. I mean, there's nothing saying you couldn't have Pacific Rim in your D&D game, except I'm going to go on a limb and say there's probably a lot of differences. Because the SRD, which is a grandchild of the OGL, says that as long as you do these things, you can use the 5e label. Strength, dex, con, perfect example. Armor class, hit points. These are the things you can use. These are certain things that if you use them, it can be 5th edition compatible and have that 5e label on it. And it's like building a model. There's certain instructions you have to follow if you want to be able to call your product 5e. But you can release a 5e product by following these rules, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with D&D. And a lot of the third-party 5e stuff doesn't. Then there's 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is different than 5e, the 5e engine, even though the bases are still there. If you look at the rest of the SRD, there are a ton of things you have to follow in a very specific way to be able to get that Dungeons & Dragons label. And not only is it just like you have to include certain rules and you have to include certain things, but it's like the way the thing looks, the way the thing's laid out, what fonts you can use, how the art is. I mean, everything from editing and presentation all the way up to language. And there's a lot of rules you have to follow in order to get that official nod from Wizards of the Coast and say, yes, this is a approved for use with Dungeons & Dragons product. So again, there's this article floating around how now that because this product's coming out, you can have the crow in your D&D game. And it's like, no. I mean, you could have the crow in your D&D game, but probably the rules are different than Dungeons & Dragons because it's designed for modern day and it's designed to take advantage of 5e, and it's designed with the idea that I just have to use the bare bones of 5e, but I can have like percentiles in there or all sorts of other PowerPoints, all sorts of other things that don't necessarily fit D&D. So the cross-pollination could happen, but I have to feel like there's a lot of cutting and pasting and rewriting you would have to do because I think the rules will be different enough that you can't just say, I'm playing a Jaeger in my D&D game. So yeah, that. Now, I made that thing about Critical Role the other day, and I got a lot of flack for it, so I posted an apology. But I'm still seeing this. I'm still seeing these posts. So without going too deep into Critical Role nonsense, what happened? Because, admittedly, I don't watch the show. So when I see these things and the fan base suddenly turns on them, the question I'm going is like, what did they do this time? Why are you suddenly saying all this stuff about them? And now they're saying things about Stranger Things too, which is weird. Because yeah, Stranger Things takes place in the 80s, so they're not playing 5th edition. They're playing the D&D that was out in the 80s, which is not 5th edition. It was probably Advanced Dungeons and Dragons they're playing, or Red Box Dungeons and Dragons. So to try and apply 5th edition mindset and 5th edition what you can and cannot do to the Dungeons and Dragons they're playing in Stranger Things is kind of weird, because it's a TV show set in the 80s, and the Dungeons and Dragons is only a very small part of it, basically to explain why they name the things way they name them, and to give sort of a just general, hey, D&D existed in the 80s. I mean, it's not the major part, and also it's not real. So when this guy is talking about how the way they play their characters in reference to the way the people are in real life is like, wait, you do understand Eleven is not a real person, right? It's a character she plays on a TV show. The individual is not 11. So when you're making these references to how, 11 did this in the D&D game, which means this for 5th edition, which means Gygax approves. Gygax doesn't approve of Stranger Things because Gygax is dead. What 11 does or doesn't do in the show is because that's the script that Millie was given to read that day on the TV show, because those people are actors portraying characters on a television show, and part of that television show is they occasionally either mention Dungeons and Dragons or might have like 5 minutes of them playing D&D or something. But yeah, so they're not real. Okay? So yeah, I guess something happened on Critical Role to make people upset. I don't know what it was, but now they're like, oh, well, Sam Riegel can't act. Oh, this is a show. I've always known this is a show. It can't be really playing D&D. Oh, they did this, and I don't like the way Mercer handled this, and this is not what Gary Gygax would have wanted. This is not 5th edition, and this happened on Stranger Things, and that's just not 5th edition, or that's bad for D&D, or that is what... It's like, no! So I don't even, again, this is not a thing. And I don't know why people are upset at Stranger Things. I don't know why people are upset at 5th edition again. I don't know why people are talking about an offhanded comment that Gini Di made about how she was mistreated when she was a young DM and somebody gave her bad advice. Out of all this nonsense, the only thing that's actually maybe newsworthy is the confusion between 5e and D&D, which hopefully I have clarified that there is a difference between a 5th edition product and a 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons product. Other than that, this nonsense over Critical Role, of which I sadly fell into, I don't know what happened on the show to suddenly get people upset at the show and suddenly go, oh wait, this is a show? And so I don't know why people are suddenly either saying Stranger Things did this, and this, or it's a TV show. Stranger Things is definitely a TV show that takes place in the 80s, where a bunch of actors are portraying characters who had shenanigans in the 80s. So I can definitely say 110% Stranger Things is not real. And the D&D they're playing in Stranger Things is because they're reading a script. Well, you're either more confused or less confused. Either way, I've done my job. So if anything I said helps you get it through the day, or if you are like me and you're just like, why is this a thing? Well, then yes, I've done my job by either confusing you or not confusing you. That's enough for today. I have been your guide to all the tabletop role-playing game news, weather, sports, and general internet nonsense. If you appreciate this ridiculousness that is my show, consider subscribing and helping me reach 700 subs by June 1st. Till next time, of course, as always, get out of my 80s, you damn kids, with your damn retro nostalgia.